Ever feel like huge changes kind of come out of nowhere? Like one minute something's not on anyone's radar, the next, bam, it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's like someone flipped a switch, right?
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're tackling that head on. We're diving into Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point to figure out what's really going on behind these mysterious shifts.
It's not random, that's for sure. The book's fascinating. Gladwell compares it to, like, how epidemics work. But instead of a virus, he's talking about ideas, trends, behaviors, all that's spreading like wildfire.
Okay, so not literally contagious, but that feeling of rapid spread, right? That's the core concept.
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of it? Because it can't just be random chance that dictates what takes off and what doesn't.
Exactly. And Gladwell lays out three major rules that govern this whole thing. And what's really wild is how they apply way beyond, say, just marketing. Think social movements, political shifts, even just like our own personal decisions.
Okay, now I'm really interested. Lay it on me. What's the first rule?
All right, so rule number one is the law of the few. It basically says forget about the masses. It's specific types of people who are like disproportionately responsible for making things spread.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of people are we talking about here?
Gladwell talks about connectors. They're those folks who always seem to know everyone. They bridge all these different social circles that most of us don't even realize exist.
Right, like that one friend who always seems to have their finger on the pulse of what's new and exciting, what's the next big thing. Yeah,
Exactly. But it's not enough to just like be in the know. The real key is they're out there sharing it. Otherwise, it's just hoarding information.
makes sense. What's the next type?
That's where the mavens come in. They're not just know-it-alls, though. These are the folks who are obsessed with knowing every little detail about, well, anything. They're all about the why behind things, and they love nothing more than to take a deep dive and share that with anyone willing to listen.
Oh, I know the type. They give you way more information than you were expecting, but you can't help but be fascinated.
Totally. And because of that, they lend a certain credibility. They fuel the spread by backing it up with all that insider info.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So we've got the connectors spreading the word. We've got the mavens giving it that extra weight. What's the final piece of the puzzle?
Well, that's where the salesmen come in. These are the masters of persuasion. And I don't necessarily mean selling a product here. It could be an idea, a belief, anything. They just have a knack for making you see things in a new light, often without you even realizing it's happening.
Okay, now that sounds a little sneaky. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Have you ever bought something just because you got caught up in a friend's excitement? Not because you actually needed it, but because they somehow made it seem irresistible.
Oh, yeah, for sure. All the time.
See, that's a salesman at work.
That's wild. Okay, so we've got the message spreaders all figured out, but what about the message itself? Doesn't it actually have to, be good to begin with?
You're absolutely right. It's not enough to just throw something out there. It's got to be sticky. Think about like those annoying ad jingles that get lodged in your brain, or a news story that really sticks with you. That's the stickiness factor Gladwell talks about.
It's like that old saying, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about making it memorable. Gladwell actually uses Sesame Street as an example. They were meticulous about researching every single little detail to make sure their educational messages really stuck with kids.
Wow, that's pretty amazing when you think about it. I guess they don't call it Sesame Street for nothing.
Right.
So it's kind of like the difference between a boring lecture and a professor who's a great storyteller. You're going to remember the stories way more.
100%.
But Gladwell doesn't just stick to psychology, does he? He takes these ideas and applies them to the real world.
Oh, absolutely. He even uses this stuff to explain that huge drop in New York City's crime rate back in the 90s.
Really? What does Sesame Street have to do with crime in New York?
Not Sesame Street specifically, but the principles are the same. And get this, the changes that made the biggest impact weren't some big sweeping overhauls. It was all about the detail.
Details. Okay, now I'm even more lost.
Well, this is where Gladwell introduces his third rule, the power of context. The idea is that our environment, often in really subtle ways, has a huge impact on how we behave.
Okay, I'm listening.
One example Gladwell talks about is how they tackled graffiti on subway cars.
Wait, seriously? Cleaning up graffiti reduced crime? That just seems like a stretch.
I know it sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
But it all ties into this idea called the broken windows theory. Basically, it says that if a place looks neglected, people are more likely to disrespect it, to break more rules.
Ah, so it's like a slippery slope.
Exactly. So by fixing those little things, by making the environment feel less chaotic, they shifted the entire context. It made it less inviting for more serious crimes to happen.
It's like they say, don't sweat the small stuff, is totally wrong sometimes. It's the little things
Right.
that create the big picture. So instead of just focusing on catching criminals after the fact, they changed the context that allowed crime to thrive in the first place.
Exactly. It's about understanding those subtle cues that we might not even realize are influencing our actions.
That's kind of freaky when you think about it.
Hmm.
Like how much of our behavior is really our own, you know?
I know, right? It's a bit unnerving. But it also shows just how sensitive we are to our surroundings. Think about how you act in a library versus like at a rock concert. Two totally different environments, two totally different versions of you, probably.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So
Right.
that's the environment. But what about timing? Doesn't having the right idea at the right time also make a huge difference?
You're totally right. Gladwell talks about that too. He uses this great example, the unexpected comeback of Hush Puppy shoes back in the mid-90s.
Hush puppies. Seriously. Those comfy suede shoes your grandpa probably wore.
Yep, those ones. And believe it or not, they were cool. Like, actually cool, not ironically cool.
What? How is that even possible?
Well, it all started with a handful of really fashion-forward kids in New York City. You know, those trendsetters who are always looking for something different, something unique. They started wearing Hush Puppies, kind of ironically at first, drawn to their retro vibe.
So it's like saying, I'm so cool that I can make anything cool, which then, ironically, actually makes it cool.
Exactly. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy of cool.
But how did it go from this tiny group of hipsters to, like, nationwide popularity?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember everyone had a pair at one point.
That's where those connectors and mavens we were talking about come into play. My guess is some fashion editor, a real connector in the fashion world, probably spotted these kids rocking Hush Puppies and was like, wait a minute, there's something special here.
They recognized that diamond in the rough, waiting to be polished and shown to the world.
Exactly. They understood that for the right people, these shoes could be huge.
Okay, but why hush puppies specifically? Why not, like, orthopedic shoes? They're comfy too.
That's the genius of the power of context. Remember, this was the mid-90s, the economy was booming, everyone was optimistic about the future, and people really wanted to express their individuality. Hush Puppies, with their retro charm and unexpected coolness, just fit perfectly into that whole vibe.
So it was the right product at the right time, amplified by the right people. So like all the stars aligned for a classic tipping point moment.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that it didn't rely on like massive marketing campaigns. It was all word of mouth, driven by genuine enthusiasm.
So no need for those $1 million Super Bowl commercials.
Not this time. This was all about tapping into something real. Once a trend hits that critical mass, it takes on a life of its own.
I love that. It's like that saying, build it and they will come. Except this case is more like live it and they will come.
That's a great way to put it.
I think what's so cool about this Hush Puppies example is that it shows Gladwell's ideas apply to way more than just, like, social issues. It's almost like he's cracked the code for understanding how anything spreads, how ideas catch fire.
Totally. It's about recognizing that change often happens in unexpected ways, and a lot of it is driven by things we're not even consciously aware of.
That's both fascinating and a little terrifying at the same time. It makes you realize how much is really going on beneath the surface.
It does. But luckily, Gradwell's got a lot more to say about all this.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. There's definitely a lot more to unpack here.
Although there's plenty more where that came from. Gladwell gives us tons more examples of how these principles play out in, honestly, some pretty unexpected scenarios. Speaking of unexpected scenarios,
Okay, hit me with it.
remember those Airwalk shoes?
Oh, yeah. Weren't those the ones with the, like, monk chilling by the pool in the ads?
Those are the ones.
I remember those. That whole campaign was so cool.
Definitely a vibe, and it all started with a real need, believe it or not.
Okay, I'm listening.
So back then, skateboarders didn't have a lot of options for shoes. They were pretty much stuck wearing basketball shoes, which weren't really designed for, all the crazy stuff skaters do.
Yeah, makes sense. Basketball shoes are for basketball.
Right. So Airwalk's founders, who were skaters themselves, were like, hey, why not make shoes specifically for skating? And the skating community was super receptive to it.
So they nailed that whole stickiness factor by being authentic,
Yeah.
by speaking directly to their target audience and giving them what they actually wanted.
Exactly. But it went beyond just like pure functionality.
You mean?
Airwalks became this symbol, a way for skaters to show their identity, to rebel against the mainstream. And remember, this was the late 80s, early 90s. Conformity was like the enemy back then.
Yeah, grunge was in, pop was out. It was all about being different.
Exactly. So Airwalk really captured that whole anti-establishment vibe.
Okay, so they had that cool factor within the skating community. But how did they go from niche market to like nationwide popularity? I mean, everyone had a pair of Airwalks at one point, even people who'd never touched a skateboard in their life.
That's where their ad agency, Lambesis, comes in. They were like masters at translating subculture cool to a wider
So
audience.
they took something really raw and edgy and found a way to make it palatable for like moms and dads too.
Exactly. Their ads were so smart, like that one with the Tibetan monk on vacation just chilling by the pool in his airwalks. It was funny, it was unexpected, and it tapped into that desire for, individuality, for breaking the rules, but doing it with a wink and a smile.
It's like they understood that teenage mindset perfectly, that need to belong, but also to stand out from the crowd. Honestly, those ads kind of make me want to dig out my old pair.
I bet. But there's kind of a tragic ending to this whole story. You don't see too many airwalks around these days.
Yeah, that's true.
Hmm.
What happened? It's not like skateboarding went out of style.
That's the thing. It didn't. What happened is that as Airwalk got bigger, they kind of fell into this trap of trying to please everyone.
So instead of staying true to their roots, they tried to branch out.
Exactly. They expanded their product lines way too much, lost that unique identity, and then they started chasing after trends instead of setting them.
It's like that band that gets super famous. Then their music loses all the raw energy that made them great in the first place. They try to appeal to everyone and end up appealing to no one.
Exactly. And on top of that, other bigger brands like Nike, they started catching on to the whole skateboarding market.
And since Airwalk had lost their edge, they couldn't compete.
Sadly, that's exactly what happened. It's kind of a cautionary tale, really. It shows that staying power isn't just about reaching that tipping point. It's about knowing what got you there in the first place and being true to that.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the hype and lose sight of your roots. It's a good reminder to always stay grounded, to remember your why. But those examples have all been, fairly lighthearted, all things considered. Gladwell tackles some tougher subjects too, Ray.
Yeah, he does. And it just goes to show you how these principles, they can apply to even like really tragic situations.
Okay, like what are we talking about here?
Well, he talks about the teen suicide epidemic in Micronesia.
Oh, wow. That's heavy stuff. What could
Yeah.
possibly cause something like that to, spike so dramatically?
It's a complicated issue with a lot of contributing factors, of course, but Gladwell uses it to illustrate this idea of like social contagion.
Social contagion. Is that
Uh-huh.
like contagious yawning, but with, suicide?
Well, kind of, yeah. It's the idea that behaviors, even really tragic ones, can spread like a virus.
Like a copycat effect.
Exactly. You see it with suicide sometimes, unfortunately. But in Micronesia, it was happening on a much larger scale.
So it wasn't just individual despair. It was something about the context, about the environment that was amplifying it, that was somehow making it seem like a more acceptable option.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And Gladwell does a good job of explaining how that happened.
So tell me more about the context. What was going on in Micronesia at that time?
Well, this was back in the 60s. You had these small, really interconnected communities. Mental health resources were extremely limited, and there was this cultural acceptance of suicide as a way to deal with shame or disappointment.
So all these factors combined created this perfect storm where suicide became tragically a more thinkable solution.
It's
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And I think what Gladwell does so well is he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. He makes the point that, yeah, it's a difficult topic, but understanding the mechanics of it is crucial if we want to prevent it from happening again.
Right. It's like they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You can't fix a problem by pretending it doesn't exist. But how do you go from understanding something so dark to actually making a difference? How do we change it?
Well, that's where Gladwell's next example comes in. He tackles something that's a little more familiar, although maybe not something we like to think about: smoking.
Okay, so we've got graphic warnings on cigarette packs, anti-smoking campaigns everywhere. Everyone knows it's terrible for you. Yet people still smoke. So what's the deal?
Gladwell's point is it's a lot more complicated than just addiction.
You mean it's not just a matter of willpower? Just quit already.
If only it were that easy, right? But Gladwell argues that smoking is as much a social epidemic as it is a physical one.
What do you mean by a social epidemic?
Well, think about how many people start smoking in the first place. It's often because of peer pressure, wanting to fit in, to seem cool, or even just because they see family members doing it.
It's a learned behavior.
That's exactly it. So we're back to that law of the few. If the cool kids are doing it, then others are more likely to follow suit.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely more. Then you've got the whole marketing machine of the tobacco industry working against you.
Right. All that money they spend to make smoking seem glamorous and cool.
Exactly. And it's been happening for decades. Think about old movies and how often people were lighting up on screen. It's all connected. And then, of course, there's the, let's call it the stickiness factor of nicotine itself. Once you're hooked, it's incredibly difficult to quit, even when you know how harmful it is.
It's like you're battling on two fronts. The social pressure to start, and then the physical addiction that makes it so hard to stop. But if smoking really is like a social epidemic, doesn't that offer some hope?
What do you mean?
Well, I'm thinking if we can change how we view smoking, how we talk about it, maybe we can change the behavior itself, right?
You're getting at Gladwell's point exactly. He talks about some really effective strategies that have been used to combat this. Things like higher cigarette taxes, like make them too expensive to afford.
Yeah, that'll work, especially for younger people.
Right, and also banning smoking in public places. That was huge.
Yeah, you don't see people lighting up in restaurants anymore. It creates this social norm that says, like, hey, this isn't cool anymore.
Exactly. And there have also been those really hard-hitting ad campaigns that expose the tobacco industry's tactics. Those have been really effective, too.
So instead of just telling people don't smoke, it's about changing the whole context that makes them want to smoke in the first place. Shift the norms, and the behavior will eventually follow. Pretty clever.
It is clever. It's about understanding the problem at a deeper level. And it reminds me a lot of those campaigns that changed how we see drunk driving now.
Oh, yeah, like those really graphic ads with the crashed cars.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's no longer socially acceptable to drink and drive, and it's made a huge difference. So, Gladwell's point is, look, we can apply these same principles to other issues too. It's about recognizing that we're not powerless here. We can create positive change if we understand the forces at play.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the bad news out there, but this is actually pretty optimistic. It gives us a roadmap for how to make things better.
That's what I like about Gladwell. He always leaves you with a sense of hope.
I'm with you. But speaking of hope, it seems like this whole episode has been a bit heavy on the doom and gloom. Can we talk about something a bit more upbeat now?
You're right. We do need a bit of a palate cleanser after all that.
Exactly. Hit me with some good vibes. What else does Gladwell have up his sleeve?
Well, Gladwell spends a lot of time in the book talking about something called the fundamental attribution error.
The what? That doesn't sound very upbeat.
It's not as bad as it sounds, I promise.
Okay, I'm trusting you on this one.
Oh.
Break it down for me. What's the fundamental attribution error?
Okay, so it's basically our tendency to, like, overemphasize personality over context when we're judging other people's actions.
Can you give me an example of that? It's kind of a mouthful.
Sure. Have you ever had someone cut you off in traffic and immediately thought, what a jerk?
Oh, all the time.
Right, so you're making a judgment about that person's character based on, like, one tiny interaction.
Yeah, I guess that's not very fair when you put it that way.
Right, that's the fundamental attribution error in action. You're assuming they're just a jerk without considering any other possibilities.
Okay, so like maybe they were rushing to the hospital or didn't see me there. It's not necessarily about me at all.
Exactly. We all do it. We see a snapshot of someone's behavior and we think we know the whole story, but we're often missing a lot of context.
Okay, I see what you mean. I can definitely see myself doing that. But how does this tie back into tipping points?
Well, Gladwell's saying that this bias, this fundamental attribution error, it can blind us to the power of context. We get so caught up in focusing on individual traits that we miss those subtle environmental cues that are actually shaping a lot of our behavior.
That's kind of a mind-blowing thought. So you're saying that sometimes, like whether or not a product takes off or a trend catches on, it's not necessarily because it's inherently better than what came before, but because of the timing, the marketing, the context surrounding it.
That's exactly what I'm saying. We like to think we're in control, but there's so much happening beneath the surface that we're not even aware of.
It's like that saying, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity.
I love that. It's so true. And it ties into what Gladwell's saying perfectly.
So understanding this fundamental attribution error, it helps us to be a little more objective about success. It helps us to recognize that context, timing, luck, they all play a role. It's not always about, who worked the hardest or who had the best idea. It's a much more nuanced view of, well, how the world works.
Absolutely. And it makes you realize that everyone's fighting their own battles, facing their own unique set of challenges.
That's a good point.
Uh-huh.
It's a good reminder to be a little more compassionate, a little less quick to judge. We've all got our own stuff going on.
Exactly.
It seems like Gladwell's work is as much about psychology as it is about sociology. Are there any other mental quirks that he digs into?
Definitely. He's got a whole section on how we process information, especially when it comes to being persuaded, which is obviously key to this whole tipping point thing. He talks about this one study where they had people watch a newscaster talking about a politician.
Okay, sounds pretty standard for like the news cycle. What's so special about that?
Well, here's the thing. The researchers were subtly changing the newscaster's facial expressions without the viewers realizing.
Okay, that's interesting. How did they do that?
It was really subtle stuff. Like, in one version, the newscaster would smile when he mentioned the politician's name, and in the other version, he would just stay neutral. A tiny little difference, right?
Yeah, so small, I doubt most people would even notice it.
That's what they thought. But get this. The people who saw the version where the newscaster smiled, they were way more likely to view the politician favorably.
Wait, seriously? Just from a smile?
I know, crazy, right? And here's the kicker. They weren't even consciously aware of why they felt that way.
Whoa. Talk about subliminal messaging.
Right. It shows just how powerful nonverbal cues can be.
Way more powerful than we realize. So it's not just what you say, but how you say it, right?
Yeah.
Your body language is speaking volumes even when your mouth is shut.
Exactly. Gladwell uses this to illustrate how persuasion works on a much deeper level than we often realize. And it's not just about marketing either. It's relevant to our everyday conversations, our relationships, everything.
Right. It's like that feeling you get when someone's words are saying one thing, but their tone of voice is saying something totally different.
100%. You're way more likely to trust your gut in those situations, right?
It's your intuition telling you something's off. So is Gladwell saying we should all be walking around like super paranoid that everyone is trying to manipulate us?
No, not at all. I don't think it's about becoming paranoid, but it's definitely about being more aware of how these subtle influences work. And once you start to see them, it's kind of eye-opening.
It's like suddenly knowing the secrets behind a magic trick.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Like you might not be able to do it yourself, but you appreciate the artistry a little bit more, you know?
Totally. Now that you mention it, it reminds me a bit of Darren Brown.
You and Darren Brown?
Yeah, he does that show. I think it's called Mind Control. He uses psychology and
Yeah.
suggestion to make people do crazy things.
Oh, yeah. He's amazing.
But the point is, he explains exactly how he does it, and it's still mind-blowing to watch. It's like, I know what you're doing, but I'm still falling for it.
Exactly. And I think that's the same kind of feeling you get when you read Gladwell. He's pulling back the curtain on these social forces that have always been there, but we've just never really noticed them before.
It's like we're all living in the Matrix, and he's offering us the red pill.
Uh-huh. That's a great analogy.
So subtle cues, facial expressions, body language.
Hmm.
What else is at play here? It seems like there's so much going on beneath the surface that we're completely oblivious to.
Oh, there's more. He also talks about this fascinating study that looked at synchrony.
Synchrony, okay, like being in sync with someone. Is this going to get all new agey on me?
No, not at all. No crystals required. It's more about how coordinated movements can really build connection. So think about like dancing together.
Or like that moment at a concert when everyone's clapping along to the beat.
Exactly. Or even just something as simple as nodding your head at the same time as someone else. All these things create this feeling of like being on the same wavelength.
Yeah, okay. I can see that. So when we're in sync with someone, we tend to trust them more. We're more open to what they have to say.
Precisely. It's all happening subconsciously, which is kind of wild when you think about it.
So you're saying that feeling of like clicking with someone, that instant connection, it's not just a feeling, it's actually making us more susceptible to being persuaded by them.
Exactly. Our brains are wired for connection, and when we feel that connection, we let our guard down a little.
Wow, that's both fascinating and a little scary. And now that you mention it, it makes a lot of sense when you think about like charismatic leaders. They're often really good at mirroring people's body language, building that sense of we're on the same team here.
You got it. It's like that thing when you reach for your coffee cup at the same time as the person you're talking to.
Instant connection.
Exactly. It creates a little burst of like, we're so in sync.
It's funny how these tiny little things can have such a big impact. But Gladwell takes this idea even further, right? He talks about emotions being contagious too.
He does. We've all felt it, haven't we? That feeling of like feeding off the energy of a crowd.
Yeah, totally. It's like that wave of excitement that goes through a concert when the band plays everyone's favorite song. You can't help but get swept up in it, even if you're feeling kind of, a minute before.
It's true. That's emotional contagion in action. We're hardwired to pick up on each other's emotions. It's how we survived as a species.
It's like back in the caveman days. If one guy freaks out and runs away, everyone else follows.
Right.
No time to ask questions.
Exactly. And we're still guided by those same instincts today, even if we don't always realize it. But it's not all fun and games. Emotional contagion can have some serious consequences, too.
Okay, now I'm a little scared again. What kind of consequences are we talking about? Don't leave me hanging.
Well, Gladwell uses the example of a bank run, where a rumor starts about a bank maybe not being financially stable.
Okay, and then what?
Well, then fear starts to spread.
Fear is contagious.
Exactly. And pretty soon, everyone is withdrawing their money, even if it's not necessarily the most rational thing to do.
So one person's panic can trigger an entire system to collapse.
It's definitely possible, yeah. But here's the thing. Emotional contagion can work for good, too. Think about social movements, for example.
Okay.
One person's act of courage can inspire others to take action.
Like a chain reaction.
Exactly. And those ripples, they can create real, lasting change in the world.
It's like that famous image of the man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square, one person's bravery sparking an entire movement.
Yes, exactly. That's a perfect example. And that's really Gladwell's point. We need to be aware of this force, both for its potential to, lead to negative outcomes, but also for its incredible power to do good in the world.
It's a double-edged sword.
100%. We've just got to be mindful of how we're wielding it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from contagious suicides to the psychology of smoking to the power of a well-timed smile. But I have to ask, what's the point of all this? What does Gladwell want us to do with all this information? It's certainly given me a lot to think about.
That's the great thing about Gladwell. His books aren't just fascinating reads, they're calls to action. He wants us to take this knowledge and actually use it in our own lives to make a difference, however big or small.
I like that. It's empowering. It's like, now that we're aware of how the game is played, maybe we can use those rules to create a better outcome.
That's exactly it. So it's less about being like an evil genius manipulating people and more about being a benevolent mastermind, using your powers for good.
So we've gone deep down the rabbit hole, huh? Contagious suicides, the psychology of smoking, the power of a smile. But Gladwell doesn't just leave us there, right? He gives us some tools to use all this tipping point knowledge.
He does, and it's not about manipulating people. It's about being more mindful, more impactful. You see the code, now here's how to maybe hack it. But hack it for good.
Okay, less evil genius, more benevolent mastermind then. So how do we use this in everyday life, not just global scale stuff?
Think about getting your team at work to try a new idea. Understanding that law of the few, maybe you figure out who those key influencers are. They don't have to be the boss, but the folks others just naturally listen to. Get them on board early.
So it's like strategic relationship building, knowing who to win over to create that ripple effect.
Exactly. Or say you're passionate about a cause, want to spread the word. The stickiness factor matters there. You don't just share boring facts, you find a way to make it stick. Personal stories, a powerful image, something memorable.
Instead of lecturing people about climate change, you show them a photo essay that really makes them feel it, connect with the issue.
Exactly. Make it stick. And even the power of context. Maybe you organize a community cleanup day. It's not just about the trash, it's about shifting mindsets. People see themselves as part of the solution, not the problem.
Small actions, ripple effect, changing the environment and hopefully the behavior that happens within it. Makes me look at random successes and failures differently now.
That's the point. Gladwell's like, think deeper. Why did that restaurant become the spot? Just the food, or were they social media geniuses creating buzz, making it the place to be seen?
It's that saying, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Gladwell's given us tools to be more prepared for those tipping point moments.
Absolutely. And honestly, one of the biggest takeaways for me is how much he emphasizes ethics.
Okay, good. Because all this hacking the code talk had me a little worried, like, we don't need more sneaky marketing tricks in the world.
I hear you. Gladwell's clear. These principles, good or bad, it's on us. Just because you can influence people doesn't mean you should, especially if it's not in their best interest.
With great power comes great responsibility. Spidey-Man knew what was up. But seriously, how do we make sure we're using this ethically?
He doesn't give a rule book, but he makes you ask yourself, is this message honest? Am I being upfront about my intentions? If someone used this on me, would I be okay with it?
It's a gut check. If it feels manipulative, it probably is.
Exactly. And that might be the most powerful thing about the tipping point. It's not just how the world works, it's us taking responsibility for our own influence and using it to hopefully make things better.
So well said. This deep dive into the tipping point has been amazing. It's like we have a whole new language to talk about change, to see the patterns in what seemed random before.
It's been a pleasure diving in with you. Hopefully, listeners are walking away a little more aware, a little more empowered to shape their own narratives and maybe the world around them too.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe this conversation, it's its own little tipping point, right? Sparks some new ideas out there, inspires some action. That's it for this deep dive. Everyone go forth and create those positive epidemics.